All right. So just to refresh you guys, I'm talking about Friedrich von Steuben's contributions to the American Revolutionary War effort, and also his contributions to the American Army, the American military at large, specifically how they're trained, the Inspector General position, just the whole mentality going into the American military is what he had a really big impact in. So I'll start with his contributions to Valley Forge, which some historians actually really only focus on this aspect. Eric Tricky his last name's Tricky, yeah, he focused a lot on his contributions in Valley Forge, saying that these essentially saved the revolution. That language for me is a little bit grandiose. I don't try to downplay his contributions to Valley Forge. He did do a lot. I talked about that a lot in the last oral presentation with how he got them to do bayonet charges, got them to march at certain beats, got them to form proper lines, all of that basic stuff. But one thing I really want to focus on with Valley Forge, in addition to that, because those are all the direct impacts, which did help a lot to form a real army under Washington, but he wrote the Blue Book, which was very influential not only during the rest of the Revolutionary War, because it was adopted 2 years after by the Continental Congress as the military training book for the entire American war effort, but it was also used up until the War of 1812, this Blue Book. So it had a lot of impact. But von Steuben, in terms of his direct military contribution to the American Revolutionary War, if you just look at his contributions to Valley Forge like Eric Tricky does, that's actually not really accurate either, because he did do more. In fact, after Valley Forge in 1780, when the war shifted to the Southern Theater, the Continental Army down there needed him. So he moved down there, he helped Nathaniel Greene train a lot of the troops. He pretty much transported his training regimen and skills from Valley Forge to the Southern Theater, where he helped the Army in the Southern Theater a lot too. But not only in terms of training did he help, during Yorktown he was out there helping the men dig the trenches. And one thing that people maybe sometimes forget about Washington, I'm not trying to downplay Washington, but he wasn't a genius strategician. He wasn't great with military strategy. And Baron von Steuben, as well as the Comte de Rochambeau, were actually really the masterminds behind the siege of Yorktown. Because the siege of Yorktown was actually, in terms of a military strategy standpoint, it was actually pretty solid. And Washington gets a lot of credit for that, which is perhaps fair because it was his men. He did lead a lot of the armies, but at the end of the day, the people who actually designed the strategy, who actually designed the siege works and stuff, was the Friedrich von Steuben and Comte de Rochambeau. So looking at his direct war impact is the one facet I'm looking at. Not only was it Valley Forge, where he was a huge influence, but it was also the Southern Theater and the Siege of Yorktown. And you can say, okay, well, how big was his impact really? I mean, the Continental Army was still seen by a lot of French troops, a lot of British troops still as just a militia. But the best thing to look at, especially with Valley Forge, was the Battle of Monmouth, which was right after Valley Forge. And some say the Americans won, the British say that the British won. It was kind of a draw, but the big point to take away from the Battle of Monmouth is that the Americans were able to fight toe-to-toe with the British. Von Steuben was out there reforming the lines. He was keeping the men intact, along with Washington and, of course, dozens of other leaders. But von Steuben he was actually out in the battlefield making sure that what he taught them went into effect. So, yes, his direct military contributions did work. Some historians downplay this. They'll say that it was moderately significant. James Hughes, he reviews a book, and he downplays a lot of the significance. But Baron von Steuben was a very significant figure, not a minorly significant figure. But there's no huge controversy over von Steuben like there is with Jefferson or Hamilton. So I don't want to make it seem as if there's this huge historical debate, but there's not a huge consensus on his legacy and how significant it was. And for the one facet, I'm arguing that his contributions during the Revolutionary War, through Valley Forge, through the Southern Theater, and through his actual strategy that he did they worked, as shown in the Battle of Monmouth, and they were significant, which is contrary to what some historians say. Now, the other facet that I'm focusing on is the longevity of his policies, how they influenced later military thinking. So we're talking after the Revolutionary War. Baron von Steuben lived in the States until the mid-1790s. I don't know the exact date. But he wasn't an active part of the American military during the War of 1812, even the Quasi-War with France. So he's not going to have any more direct military impacts. But he still had a huge impact on the American military. So, for one example, when George Washington started to form the first, I shouldn't say standing army, but he started to form the first legions, which was a limited standing army. He pretty much worked directly off of von Steuben's arguments. And as I mentioned earlier, his Blue Book was incredibly influential. It was used until the War of 1812. So in terms of how troops were trained up until the War of 1812, into the War of 1812, it was huge. And this was directly, the Blue Book was actually used pretty much verbatim. So when they started to revise military training books, they still used a lot of von Steuben's language, and pretty much the outline of his Blue Book stayed intact until the Mexican-American War. So he influenced an entire generation of military thinkers with this Blue Book. But I also want to point out some of the more subtle influence he's had on American military training. And Trickey, although I'm not a huge fan, as I meant before, he actually served in the military, and he pointed out how American military training culture owes a lot to von Steuben. So one of the examples he does is this kind of humorous play that generals and training generals often have with their recruits, and von Steuben was he was very humorous with his men as well. And that's one of the more subtle cultural things that he left with us.